And the first thing that we're going to work on is just to talk about the basics of masking, right? To create kind of a basic object. And to start this, I am going to unlock just the background layer. I'm going to come over here to my tools panel and grab just a circular shape, and this will give us kind of a base to work with in terms of having something to mask into. So one of the first things that everybody needs to understand about Photoshop is the process of using clipping masks, right? So if I were to create another layer on top of this circle, let's say we wanted to give this circle kind of a treatment and of sort of light to dark. We want to give this some dimension. We want to give it some depth. Well, a way to do that is to grab a brush, take the hardness to 0, take the size way up, select whatever your base color is, and let's actually, just for the sake of learning, let's start with a mid-tone, right? Let's start with an absolute mid-tone so we can add highlights and shadows in either direction. We'll come back to this top layer, and you say, okay, if the light source is coming from the top left, then this side would need to be dark. And so we'll grab a darker gray, but we don't want to just throw it all over the canvas. We want it to be confined within the space. So I have a blank layer above my main object, and I'm just going to hold Alt while I hover between the two layers, and that's going to create a clipping mask. And you see here in my history it says create clipping mask. Now when I go in and start to work on that object, all I'm doing is painting within the defined area, whatever the base of the clipping mask is, right? So let's make this a little bigger. We'll just very lightly touch that shadow a little bit, and I am working on a 24-inch Cintiq, or 22 or 24-inch Cintiq attached to a 27-inch iMac if you're interested in that. Now, the great thing about this workflow, though, is we can keep going, right? I'm going to create another blank layer with another clipping mask. I'm going to use my eyedropper tool to, again, select that mid-tone base. And then I'm going to come up here and select even a lighter color. I'm not going to go to pure white. And then I can come over here and just touch this side of the sphere with a little bit of that lighter color. So you can see how we have this basic workflow of the basic shape, and then we're going to paint inside the shape using clipping mask. And you can have clipping masks from here all the way to the top of the browser, right? There are no limits to the amount of clipping masks we can use. Let's say we want to come back into this mid-tone. I'm going to grab this. Now, instead of using a soft brush to create this kind of feathered effect, I'm going to hit L to grab the lasso tool, and the lasso tool is really interesting. The lasso tool, you can just kind of freehand draw with the lasso tool, either with your mouse or with a pen on an input device. You hit Command D to deselect. And the lasso tool creates a live selection area. Now that's useful. For example, let's say I wanted to create that selection in my clipping mask. Then I'm going to hit G for the paint bucket tool, and I'm going to just fill that in, right? So it gives me sort of a defined selection that I can work with. Let's say maybe we take that to a dissolve blending mode and take that all the way down. If we wanted to do a little rough, some of that kind of rough look in terms of a texture falling into our shadow there. So for me, the main workflow in terms of mimicking dark and light and dimension in Photoshop, everything is built on this clipping mask situation. Now, the clipping mask is really important, and then layer masks are the other really important foundation. So let's say this is kind of our shadow, and we don't have to be perfect with it, but we'll create a dark shape, we'll stick it underneath everything. Now, a proper shadow is not really going to hold its opacity all the way through. It'd be nice if we could sort of fade the edge of this shadow away a little bit, if that was possible. And we can do that in a non-destructive fashion by coming down here to the bottom of the layer panel. And if you hover over this, it's basically a rectangle with a circle in it. It creates this icon here. This is a layer mask, and this allows me to, if I have a black brush selected, it will actually paint away what's there. And if I switch and hit X and go to white, it'll actually bring it back. So the clipping mask and the layer mask are both super important. Let me just make sure we're streaming okay here. Okay. So that's kind of the basic, right? Once you can understand this workflow, then it's a question of continuing to study our art basics, and then I think doing a lot of painting and illustration within Photoshop. So this is going to be our lit sphere here. Now let's do kind of a more complex shape so we can talk a little bit about shape layers as well. Oh, excuse me. There's a bit of a stomach bug going around at my house at the moment that I'm definitely feeling. So I'm going to take this to full screen. So let's do a little bit more of a creative illustration, so we have to force ourselves to get the pen tool out and create a more interesting shape. So that's a little thick. So if we're going to do an illustration that's a little bit more of an interesting shape, I think it's easier first to have just our brush tool out so we can do some sketching. And let's create some lines. Maybe we can do a vase that's a little more like so. And I'll just pull my eraser out, try to find an overall shape that I like. We'll sort of do this below the horizon line so we can see into the vase a little bit. Now, from here, if you have a sketch, and let's say this was the basic form of our vase that we're going to work on. Actually, let me actually hit Command and play with the perspective tool a little bit and see if we can end up with a little bit more of an interesting or a dramatic shape. So we'll make it a little more contrasted in terms of its form at the top and at the bottom. So for me, now getting out the pen tool and working with shape layers inside of Photoshop is going to be the way to kind of set this scene up. And working with shape layers is a really good skill to work on inside of Photoshop for a motion designer because Photoshop is such an important design tool. So let's create a basic shape that kind of encompasses the entire shape that we have. I'm going to turn it off. Then I'm going to hit my pen tool again and create another shape. I'm going to hold Alt to break that tangent. Broke it a little too much in that direction. I want to try to follow our sketch. Now, the great thing about shape layers in Photoshop, in my view, is it keeps this little icon open telling me it's a shape layer, and you can really change the color on the fly. So we'll say, all right, it's going to be a little darker, maybe not that dark, on the interior. So we're getting kind of the basics of our sketch worked out here. The other great thing about shape layers is I can see my shape is a little wonky. And similar to Illustrator, if you hit A on the keyboard, and then hold down Command and double click, you can start to move around these individual shapes, right? The shape stays live, actually. I'm going to try to make that a little bit more of a pleasant shape. Might have to kind of readjust what we're doing on the back end there. Come down to this shape. And try to clean up that shape a little bit. We don't necessarily need to totally see the top of that. Let's have those tangents touching. So shape layers, if you're gonna do a lot of 2D illustration, and you're gonna want to do things that have, that kind of Photoshop that Photoshop effect where you want to get out cool brushes and you want to add texture and you don't want it to just be that flat Illustrator vector art, then getting comfortable with shape layers is a great way to, if it makes sense for the shot and you don't need vectors, to kind of skip over the Illustrator workflow a little bit. And let's just go ahead and clean that up. So let's say that's kind of where we want to be on the shape. Now the great thing about having these shape layers is I can begin to build a kind of clipping mask stack on top of it. So let's just work with this interior shape. If I hit I to get the eyedropper tool, I'll get that interior color, and let's say I want to go even darker. And again, right, we can do an illustration in a more graphical view. Like let's say I'm going to hit Command D. Let's say I wanted harder lines. I wanted a more graphical approach to doing the illustration. Or we can go back, we're not going to use the lasso tool, or I'm going to hit B to bring up my brush tool, say 0% hardness. I'm going to bring the size way up and do something more like a gradient. So let's do something a little softer on this one. So we'll kind of add that gradient feel that it's getting darker inside. Now to the actual base shape, let's say we want really more of a mid-tone, more in the middle. Let's start building a clipping mask stack on top of that. So again, I to grab the eyedropper tool to get that tone. And let's start with the brighter side, and we can just stick with this same process we're doing where we'll have our light direction coming from the left. I'm just going to very lightly tap with a big soft brush to just create that effect like there's some light coming from this way. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to add it to my clipping mask stack on top of this base shape. I'm going to grab that tone. I'm going to go a little darker. I'm going to hit B, and we're going to add a little bit of shadow to this side. Now, if we want to get really fancy and add an even more realistic touch, we could add another blank layer. Come back and grab this lighter color, make our brush way smaller, and just add that little bounce rim light that you often see. That might have been a little small on the brush. Yeah, let me pull back on that a little bit actually. Let me use a larger brush. And just get a little bit of light to wrap around that one. Maybe I'll just fade that down a little bit. So we can continue then to kind of push the contrast of what we have here. We can create another layer, make sure it's stacked. Now maybe we add, maybe we do add a little bit more of a textured side to this. Actually, you know what I want to do? Let's add a little bit more, excuse me, I'm going to add a little bit more darkness to this side. I just want to push that a little bit. Then I'm going to grab an eraser, maybe create a little bit more of a pattern. And, excuse me, I actually want to take that hardness all the way up. As though the vase has a little bit of character to it. So this shape is looking a little dark, isn't it? We can pull that back a little bit. We definitely want it to have that contrast in there. Pull back on that a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit more highlighting, so I'm going to go even brighter, hit B. And this is where we could get into the various brush types, right? We can have just a basic brush and treat it really soft, so we're just kind of fading things in, fading light and dark. As we said, we can use the lasso tool to create really graphical lines in an illustration. Or we can grab something like a speckled brush and see what kind of feel that gives us, right? Like maybe there's just a little bit of bright speckle sitting in the highlight here. Maybe we make this even smaller and try to get a more defined kind of sheen line on it, right? Try to get it to give that feel a little bit. On my background, I'm going to add a kind of just like a background cyc by using a gradient overlay. And instead of this white to black, I just want white to like very light gray. Give me that kind of cyc wall vibe. I'm going to grab all that, make it a little smaller here. One thing we can do for our shadow, instead of creating it from scratch, is actually just make a copy of whatever that base layer was. Turn it to black, and then I'm a big fan of the holding down Command to grab a point and shifting it in perspective. Right? So if it's going to be out this direction or out this direction, we can just grab the shape and see and kind of see what we get, right? Kind of creates the illusion that the light is coming from this kind of front left side of the screen. We'll add a layer mask this time. I'm going to grab a black brush that's very large, that has 0% hardness, and just kind of fade it into the corner there, fade it into the edge. So I would definitely encourage you to, you know, kind of follow along with this type of stuff, do these kind of tests on your own. It's not going to be perfect. We're going to have to work with that shape layer. It's the other reason I really am starting to love shape layers even more, though, inside of Adobe Photoshop. Perhaps something like that. So this, to me, is kind of the basic pattern of doing artwork inside of Photoshop, making things, you know, either really graphical or really more realistic in terms of trying to make them softer. And I'm just going to check in with the web browser here. So the next thing I want to talk about in Photoshop is perspective. We're going to look at the workflow on perspective in both Photoshop and Illustrator. I'm going to hit F to full screen this. So in perspective drawing, the first thing that we need is a horizon line, right? 1, 2, and 3 point perspective are really simple and easy to learn. The first thing we determine is our horizon line. Everything above the horizon line we're looking up at. Anything below the horizon line we're looking down at. There's 1, 2, and 3 point perspective. I think if you're new to perspective drawing, just focus on learning 1 and 2 point. Unless you're a super hardcore storyboard artist, it's not likely you're going to be using 3 point a ton. So I had a friend who showed me a trick on using the, let's come over to our little shape panel here, and using the polygon tool. When you select the polygon tool, you get some settings up here. And you want to select star, and you want to indent sides by 99%. And when you do this to a polygon, it ends up looking like this. It looks like this absolutely crazy star shape that sends a million lines in every direction. So if we had 1 point perspective in our scene, we would need to make sure that the absolute center point of our polygon, of these lines, matches up with our horizon line. And if we have that, then we have the ability to use that as a guide, use that as a reference guide inside of Photoshop, right? So if it was 1 point, and let's say we had kind of an overhead view of maybe like a farm or something, I could start to just use these lines to start blocking in shapes, right? And with 1-point perspective, all of our horizontal lines are going to be straight across, and these lines then follow the path. And that was quite bad. Follow the path back, right? And so maybe we're looking up at certain objects. The same rule applies. Try to stay on that line. So that is setting up 1-point perspective. Now it's just as easy to grab that shape and offset it to one side, duplicate it, bring it to the other side. And now I have a setup for 2-point perspective. And I really like this workflow in Photoshop. And let's say, typically we don't want our points to be exactly even across. But just for the sake of demo, we could be pretty extreme here. So this is a really, really, really pinched perspective. And let's say our client needs like an illustration of, an iPhone, let's say, that's sitting in the middle of the shot. So let's say that's going to be the front edge of the iPhone. Well, now I can just kind of connect the dots and follow these lines, right? I guess I should make this a little bigger so it's easier to see on the demo. So for our first sketch, we could say, well, nope, actually it needs to be more that line. Can also use the lasso tool for quick deleting. Let's say we've got some like buttons on the side, that kind of thing. Let's say we've got our little button layout. And we're just going to follow the lines. And so these grid lines, which are very easy to create, again, using the polygon tool, if you missed that, using the polygon tool and coming up here, and by default, it's not going to say 99 sides and behave like a star. So you are going to have to tweak that, but then getting those polygons into place as guides to begin your perspective work, whether it's 1-point or 2-point, inside of Photoshop should be very easy and very quick to accomplish. So then the question is more about the contents of the shot. Now, Adobe Illustrator is also a really great way to set up something in perspective. They have a built-in tool. So if you hit Shift-Command-I, it simply brings up a tool that we can manipulate here. If we come over to the panel, or you can hit Shift-P to grab the Perspective Grid tool. And here we can adjust the horizon line, excuse me. So we'll leave the horizon line as is. I'm going to pull this up, and I'm going to pull this down a little bit. And the interesting thing about this tool is if you look up here in this left corner, we get this little box, right? It's a little cube. And so if I were to click on the right side and then grab a shape, when I begin to make that shape, it's going to distribute it along that side of the perspective. It's just going to behave that way. So that's a really, really quick, interesting way. Like let's say we had the same shot, but we would rather just do it in Illustrator. We have this iPhone. Okay, well that's that panel. I can hit Shift-P to go back to my Perspective Grid tool, click on the other side, hit M to bring up the Rectangle tool, and then come at it from this side, right, and lay in that piece. So let's say that's about right. Create a little bit of a difference here. And of course, with the Illustrator tool, you can just be incredibly precise, right? Because it's actually measuring the distance for you, right? So I can see that 1 square on this side matches 1 square on this side even though it's a little more compressed, but it's the right distance in terms of measuring perspective, right? So if I hit Shift-Command-I and take that off, then we get kind of a similar thing here with having a really quick perspective setup, which is really, really useful. Now this is a super pinched kind of perspective, so actually, you know, dragging this out all the way to the corner is probably going to create something that doesn't look as distorted. And let's see. Nope, don't want to mess with that. Yeah, I want to take these way out. It's like I don't think our client would love seeing the iPhone that pinched. So if we delete that, let's just try that again. Yeah, let's just do stroked lines actually for now. I'm going to hit Shift P, come back to this right side, hit M, Shift-Command-I, and there we go. Now we have an illustration with exact proper perspective given where we set up our anchor points. And now we can begin to kind of build out a more interesting illustration. So I think that's a really important kind of workflow in either Photoshop or working in Adobe Illustrator, right? So let's go back to Photoshop for a moment here. Let's see, just making sure the stream is running. Sometimes it gets a little shifty on me, so I got to make sure it's still running. You know what we should do? We should, yeah, let's do it in Photoshop. I'm just going to create a new scene. And let's create a scene. Let's challenge ourselves to create a scene that is a little more environmental and features like a really large structure. So I'm going to do the horizon line. I'm going to kind of split it in half. I'm going to come over here, make a really big shape so I can offset it a little bit. I'm going to duplicate it. We're going to do it in 2-point perspective. I like to group those so I can turn the opacity down. And let's just start with a little bit of an illustration. I'm just looking at these lines and following these lines. Right, that line's going to fall perfectly there. This line kind of comes back this direction. So that's a pretty big object. Now I'm going to kind of define the size of this by adding some kind of sidewalk features here. And we're going to have to work on that to make sure these are all following the proper lines. And I definitely invite you to just play around with this kind of stuff. So let's add a shape. And add a gradient overlay to that. And let's say this is going to be water going from... Gradients to me are a good way to just add like a little bit of texture to what you're working on, and can start to help you think about the light source of your scene. So like already we could maybe just go ahead and determine that the light's going to be, again, coming from this top left side. So that's going to tell me a lot about my building structure, that this face, let's say, is going to be pretty dark, while as opposed to this side should be much lighter. And for me, I'll just kind of stick to gray tones initially, just so that it's a little bit easier. So I'm actually going to sketch a little more. We could try to make this a little more... I'm going to hit R to be able to rotate my canvas a little. Just to try to get a little offset in this. I can see that's not really right. And if you're like me, you're bad at drawing. So what you end up doing is kind of blocking things in and then refining and shaping. And, you know, it's totally fine if those first lines are just not good. And you have to... See, that line doesn't look right, does it? It needs to follow that line more. Let's say these are something or other. Add some detail. And the sketch is going to be important for sure. Can add a little bit of variety here. Let's say it's got some towers. And I have a really bad habit of kind of running my sketch too close to the edges. Should have kept it smaller. So the other thing we can do is lay in a shape for our ground plane. And this is where, like, understanding your ground shape, understanding shape layers, understanding clipping mask, understanding layer mass is basically the path to doing anything you need to do. Then the question just becomes, you know, aesthetically what you're trying to design, what is the style, you know, what is the shot, what does the shot require? And for me, when it comes to color and doing something like this, the color is always really bad at first. And so if you struggle with like starting to block stuff in and then you're like, well, these colors look like crap, please know that that is also my process. And I really, for me, it's like I have to start to see everything coming into place. So this will be our light side. This will be our darker side. We'll make it even just a touch darker. And let's go ahead and start thinking about a shadow. Let's do like a really long shadow that we don't even see the edge of. Just put that here. And I'm going to take that pretty close to black. Maybe it's more like there. I'm going to add a gradient color overlay for this backdrop here. We can just kind of do naturalistic colors for now. And a little Also a little saturated. That's okay. So let's go ahead and create even more small details. Maybe there's like kind of a base shape that it's sitting on. Maybe there's kind of another piece of sidewalk. I'm just going to turn that off for now. So you can see how this can start to take shape pretty easily. Let's go ahead and try to create a sense of scale here by creating a circle as a kind of stand-in for a tree. Instead of red to green, we'll do something pretty extreme. The other reason I like gradients here is we can kind of use them for the overall lighting of our scene just by changing the gradient angle. And I can tell that is probably way too saturated. It's okay. I'll do the same thing here and start to put a... It's too crazy. I just want two colors. Just so that it's not totally flat, since we're using all these other gradients. So from here, take that rectangle, hit Command, call it a shadow. Make sure it's fully black. It's a little thin, but I think I'm okay with that. Let's just create a sense of scale here. And they shouldn't all be the same size, add a little variety. Make sure it's actually behind our building. So we're getting kind of a weird building in the middle of nowhere. I think we would need to add quite a few more buildings here. Let me see, stream's still working. So yes, this is where you get into now doing a heck of a lot of refining, continuing to build in shapes, but hopefully this shows you the framework for how you would attack a shot like this. If you have a shot that's in perspective inside of Photoshop or Illustrator, hopefully this gives you a confidence in knowing how you're going to block everything in. From here, it's a question of doing way more painting and way more adding in of shapes. You know, I think we could definitely you know, add more to this building. Actually, let's actually make it more like a religious building with an arch against a straight shape. I'm going to hit A to pull that shape down. I'm going to leave solo mode here. So we could kind of cut into these big shapes, right? Once you have the big shapes, then it's really about kind of carving in. Let's see if we add a gradient here. But we want it at 0. That's going to give it kind of an indent feeling, which I think is kind of interesting. But the dark is just too, we want to be a little more subtle than that. And the white is probably a little harsh. Now that's creating more of like a stone effect that's been kind of carved into in this smooth way. The other really big thing I would want everyone to understand is once you start to build out scenes like this in Photoshop, you start to get a ton of layers. And for me, I don't stop to name everything as I'm doing it, especially because for me, like the first 20, 30 minutes of finagling a scene like this, it's like really ugly and you're just making big decisions. So I'm going to wait to fully clean everything up for an animation if that's where it's going. But one of my favorite things in Photoshop now is just command click, as opposed to searching through the layers and seeing which is which. I'll just go right to the scene, hold command and click, hold command and click, hold command and click, and it just selects that object in the scene. So for me, that creates, it's like, oh, this, you know, this tree needs to move here. Oops. Command clicking, and then for me, just I'm more interested in like figuring out if the scene is any good or not, or if it's like on an interesting trajectory. And let's add some gradients to the side here too. And that's a little too much. And we actually are going to take it and let's make the front side perhaps a little bit lighter so we can kind of feel the light wrapping around that object. Gradients can really do a lot of heavy lifting as opposed to, you know, grabbing a brush and going in. Now, of course, once you have all these objects, once you have everything blocked, so let's say this object here, let's go ahead and create a clipping mask, little stack right here. Let's go grab some of those speckled brushes and let's see what happens. Way too big and the wrong color. Let's make it just a little lighter. Right, we could add a little bit of texture to that really easily. Come to this side object. I'm going to need to rasterize the layer style of that corner there. And we'll just go a touch lighter. Oops. I actually have to draw it on the proper layer. And so that would be, I think that would be the workflow, right? Is kind of blocking in shapes, especially on an environmental scene like this, if it's going to be in perspective. And I can see my shadow feels a little bit wrong. Feels like it should be a little more like so. Just command clicking and then command clicking those corners when I have the A tool selected, which is this tool here. So, let's see. I think we're going to kind of call it a wrap on that. Let's just see. Let me pull up some other scenes and we can maybe look. And so this same exact process, right? Using shape layers, using gradients is using clipping masks, using layer masks, using gradients, designing your scene. To me, Photoshop is just an incredible way to quickly knock out scenes like this. Let's see, which one was this? Oh, this was that one, the Utah. Working a little more on a phone scene. This was an approach that was a little more stylized, kind of style framey of the kind of empty phone. And again, you think about that phone structure right there. I had my 2-point perspective grid out. I'm just kind of eyeballing the lines. I wanted to draw the kind of wireframe of an iPhone and do this kind of effect in the middle. And then I'm getting all this noise again through the dissolve blending mode, right? Where I'm going to use the lasso tool to kind of cut the frame in half and then turn that purple solid into a dissolve to get that noisy texture. I didn't necessarily like go over the top and paint that in. So that one was kind of an interesting approach. This was a scene that had, I think, some promise, but I think it's got a ways to go. And again, that same, let's actually full screen this. You know, that same workflow, right? Where this is in 1-point perspective. So all my shapes across the front are flat. Everything's pulling back into this single point. I'm using gradients and I'm using kind of blending modes to create this feeling of atmosphere. And that one I think is kind of heading a promising direction. I think it just needs more detail, but I'm liking the colors. Let's see, what were some other ones that we could look at here? Yeah, here was another good example of kind of quickly using Photoshop to create an illustration. I had like a little flower on a little kind of stick with a bee coming into the scene. Let's actually very quickly. Sometimes it's nice to be just really rough. So I'm going to create. Let's create like a shape that's going to be a piece of wood. Let's go ahead and get a stack going in terms of a clipping mask stack. Let's go a little darker. I'm going to use L for the lasso tool and then G to fill it in. I'm going to create another one. Do it again, except this time I'm going to grab the color and just go lighter. Maybe a lot lighter. It's got to be clipping. Don't think I went light enough. So to me, that's a really interesting look. I really like the graphical approach to doing this. Like we could have painted this, you know, with softer brushes to create that, but sometimes it's really cool to just keep things blocky and imperfect, and it's making the appearance of kind of harder edges. And this type of look, I think, tends to kind of play nicely if you grab some kind of speckled brush, right? Let's see. And then maybe go to like a lighter one, maybe more of a mid-tone. And then maybe we do one more stack at the very top and we go super dark. And we try to make it a little darker at the bottom. To me, the graphical look can be just really cool in Photoshop. So again, just like having your base shape with a shape layer and then using the lasso tool to kind of come in and oops, need to create another layer. I'm going to select that one, go way lighter. And do something a little more graphical. So, you know, this workflow is the foundation of making all of your artwork in terms of your graphical illustrations or more realistic illustrations inside of Adobe Photoshop. Let's look at this palm tree scene, or just this palm tree I was working on here as another example. So this would be, I think, an example of where I'm being a little, I'm being graphical, but I was using a soft brush to create a more realistic gradient across the face of the object, right? And it's very cartoony, and it's really fun to, like, if you have a lot of kind of things that are sitting close together, to get in there and again use your clipping mask stacks to kind of create the appearance of shadows. Adding little colors variations in there I think is really cool. Again, like, you know, kind of creating these lines across the face of it, having this kind of specular highlight line using a really speckled brush on top of that more soft gradient foundation, I think is a cool way to approach making some artwork in that way. Let's see, which vase was this? Uh-oh, nope, I'm gonna close some other shots. So that's gonna be it for today, everybody. I hope that this is showing you some of the absolute foundations, some of the basics. In the following sessions, we're going to try to build out more of these scenes and more of these illustrations and kind of dig into more specific details on digital painting. But for me, you have to understand these basics in order to get to that place where you can start to think about more creative applications of this. So hopefully you understand kind of what we're talking about in Photoshop here, of using shape layers, using clipping masks, using layer masks, having light and dark, having that basic perspective set up to use these pieces of software to create the artwork that you want to create. So thank you to everybody who is checking this out today. We'll see you again next Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard. And for any questions or comments, hello@mographmentor.com, or hit us up on Twitter @mographmentor. And thanks so much for watching. Have a good Wednesday, everybody.